Hello and welcome to On the Money, where the business of Russia is business. I'm Peter Lavelle. Where is the Russian economy going, and do the government and the central bank have a sound growth strategy? Over the past few months, we have witnessed the government change its economic assumptions and policies by 180 degrees. Is this a sign of panic or sound judgment? I'm joined by Chris Weafer. He is a senior partner with Macro Advisory. And we also have Yaroslav Lissovolik. He's the chief economist at Deutsche Bank, Russia. Okay, Chris, if I can start with you first. Is the government battening down the hatches? Because 3 months ago, we saw spending increased. We worked on the assumption that the government would continue spending to keep the economy stimulated. And now, here we are almost in October, and we have an October report coming out about what the budget's going to be. It's completely reversed. Why?
Well, I think the way the government is looking at it is that they're emphasizing stability. And, you know, there's still a great deal of uncertainty in the global economy. Of course, as we've seen with the on-off actions of the Fed, they will, they won't, they kind of comes to tapering. And we do expect another round of at least uncertainty in the Eurozone as the ECB maybe tackles the banks. Is
tightening up the budget the right strategy?
I don't believe so. I think it's been proven time and time again that tightening budgets, you know, it might maintain stability for a while, but the danger is you might even see some further retraction in the economy. You know, historically, this is a strategy to say that the IMF has used many times, going into countries in trouble and insisting on budget cuts, making the matters worse. And now, you know, the thinking is you're better off expanding spending, but in the right area. So I think on the one hand, you know, the government is now certainly focusing on stability through the winter until they see what the global environment is like, perhaps coming into this spring, rather than taking risks. But also, it's quite clear there's a lot of uncertainty as to where the changes in spending should come.
Oh, that's true, because if you work for a government institution, there's a lot of uncertainty attached to it. Yaroslav, is this the right strategy? Because, again, I mean, was there a tipping point for over the last 3 months that would make the government swing so much? Because, you know, talking to economists and people, investors, and looking at the economy, they were assuming that the Putin's administration would continue with its past policies the last couple of years, and now this abrupt reverse.
Yes, I think one of the factors certainly was the deterioration in tax collection and some of the weakness in the economy that was especially pronounced in the second quarter of this year. So I think to some degree, I would say that the government is playing it safe and is making sure that going forward, the budget has enough reserve to deal with potential external shocks to which Russia is susceptible. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that we're entering into a new paradigm of outright cuts that are going to continue inexorably further down the road. I think this is more about increasing efficiency and increasing the targeted character of spending. So actually, my view would be that probably it is possible to combine growth and somewhat lower spending as long as you have more efficient spending, more targeted spending in key areas such as especially the social sphere.
You know, Chris, you know, it seems to me, you mentioned, you know, when the IMF goes in, that paradigm here, but Russia is not nearly in that situation right now. I mean, is this something specific? Because we have austerity in Europe. We have a different kind of austerity we might in the United States with the budget battle coming up here. But how would you put Russia into that? Because it just seems to me that Putin is just skittish about debt, and he looks at it as a national security issue.
Right. Yeah, no, he's made that speech many times over the last 12 years or so. He certainly views a high level of debt as leaving a country vulnerable.
But Russia doesn't have high levels of debt.
No, it doesn't. But, I mean, he's paranoid about it, you know, maybe creeping higher. We'll see the debt level increase, but very modestly, I think, in the next couple of years. That's the plan. But, you know, any suggestion that the budget's going to run, say, 4 or 5% deficits and then, you know, build up the debt, that's definitely off the cards as long as Vladimir Putin's president.
Is this just a result of the 1990s? I mean, the default, and, you know, this is still on everyone's mind.
Absolutely.
To this day.
I think the trauma that was experienced by the economy, by the populace, by the society, associated with how great the decline was, how severe the debt burden at the time was, I think that still, to some degree, feeds this aversion to greater debt within the society and also in the top echelons of power. As they look around, they see that still a lot of the developed world is engulfed and encumbered with tremendous amounts of debt, and probably this is still going to be a significant constraint on the speed of recovery in the developed world and the speed of recovery, quite frankly, of the world economy as a whole. So accordingly, I think going forward, perhaps as investors have a more differentiated view in terms of their preferences, they will seek out those countries that have a stronger balance sheet. And Russia is precisely in this category. It has one of the best sovereign balance sheets in the world.
This is what Putin likes. This is for him. It shows that Russia is a stable country. It has its books balanced. It's not an indebted country, because I think, as Yaroslav pointed out here, this is something that is almost kind of psychological here.
Sure.
I mean, Russia can go around the world and say we're a creditor nation in the world. We're not a debtor nation. And as Yaroslav pointed out, the developed world overall is an intensely indebted part of the global economy.
But there's two parts to it. I mean, on the one hand, there's the stability, and clearly, Russia looks relatively very strong in terms of balance sheet. The second part of the equation is, driving growth. You're not going to drive growth just because you've got a big pile of cash in the balance sheet. So now we're coming into this debate over the budget and where the cuts might come and where spending might be shuffled around. That's going to be critical because, again, Yaroslav pointed out, it's where the spending cuts and where the spending will be.
Okay, I'm going to put you guys on the spot. Where are they going to be? Minus defense, because it looks like they're not going to touch that. But where else? And this is, and to go back to Chris's point here, I mean, stability is the key word here. But if you go after too many of these programs, it does create instability. It has an opposite effect.
It does, and clearly Russia's problem right now, or I guess one of the issues it needs to address, is the build-up of investment. We saw a big drop in investment spending last month, for example, but generally over the years, the level of investment in Russia is too low. There needs to be a bigger, sustained increase in investment to expand the economy, to develop new industries, etc., to create diversification, and we're not seeing that right now. Now, clearly, that's the bigger issues to do with the lack of institutional reform, the perception about corruption, legal protections. These are much bigger issues that need to be dealt with. But in the meantime, in terms of budget spending, the government does need to get this right. If they cut spending in the wrong area, we're going to see lower growth and possibly an economic crisis second quarter next year.
I disagree on that one. That's a very good point.
I completely agree. Yeah, I think ultimately Russia will have to find a way to reorient fiscal outlays from social outlays into investment, into infrastructure.
Infrastructure, okay.
But in order to do that, you need institutional reform. You need to have that capability to spend efficiently on infrastructure. So this is really the crunch time now, whether Russia is capable of doing precisely that.
Well, Chris, bring it a little closer to home. I assume that Moscow is being spruced up for the Sochi Games, okay, because there's a lot of buildings being refurbished. And there's a manic rush to create new sidewalks. I think you've noticed that too. I mean, going back to what Yaroslav said, is this being done efficiently? Because governments that's not their strongest card, but this has to be a strong card for Russia to make sense of everything that both of you have just said on this program.
Yeah. Look, as far as I can see, we're at a transition point, a very important transition point. And if you expand it out a bit, you could say, in 2008, Putin's previous two terms, it was all about the oil wealth coming into the economy, trickling down, creating the consumer boom, etc. Then we had crisis years, 2009 until, say, relatively, arguably still, but in the last 4 or 5 years, it's all been about just containing the domestic situation in the face of global uncertainty. But now it's very obvious that Russia, in order to achieve the growth that clearly it needs, which is more like 5% sustained annual growth, we're going to have a new driver, and that new driver must be investment. So we're at the point where...
Must be investment, but is it going to happen?
Well, I think, we're at the point now where I think there's much greater awareness of what needs to be done and what the consequences of not getting it right are. There's a lot of planning going on. I can't say today that they're doing it right or wrong. What you can say is we're at the point of, there's a better understanding that this needs to happen. We see some initiatives, for example, with the Russia Direct Investment Fund, and a couple of weeks ago, for example, the government of Abu Dhabi announced that we're going to commit $5 billion to infrastructure. So there's the right noises so far, but it's far too early yet to be either confident or cynical that this is going to be a waste of time. Over the next couple of years, we'll know, but clearly it will only work money and attracting money from the likes of Abu Dhabi is one thing, but the institutional reform to make it happen efficiently, to make sure that money is spent and not wasted or stolen, that's going to be key. So getting money is part of it. Making sure that money is deployed efficiently will be the bigger challenge. But we're at the start of that process.
I think there's also the clear eagerness on the part of the authorities to work with the private sector in improving the fiscal framework in terms of infrastructure projects. We're seeing that the Ministry of Finance is very active in looking at specific projects and looking at imposing conditionality and looking at how monitoring could be improved in order to raise the efficiency of investment projects. So I think now, in my view, there's as Chris has said, far greater awareness, far greater emphasis on how to render this push, investment push, more efficient, more targeted.
What do you think the budget's going to look like October 1st?
Well, I mean, I think it's what I can say is that I believe that whatever proposals we see on October 1st, the final version will look different. I think this is the budget, revised budget. I think that'll be the start of the negotiations, and clearly the stronger ministries with greater lobbying power. As we saw earlier this year with privatization, that complete change. Those who've got the lobbying power and the political muscle, tend to come out of this much more favourably. So what I'm hoping, of course, what I'd love to see is, a big cut in defence spending.
No, you're not going to see that. No, you're not going to see that.
But that's what we'd like to see, and more money going into the social sphere, into areas that, can sustain consumer activity and etc. But
you think Chris is running for office here? The mayor election is over. All right, gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break here. After a short break, we'll continue our discussion on Russia's economy. Stay with our team. Welcome back to On the Money, where the business of Russia is business. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're talking about Russia's economy and government strategy. But before we continue our discussion, let's have a look at this report.
Production levels in Russia have surpassed pre-crisis figures. This is quite an impressive accomplishment compared to the other G8 economies. The US and Germany are only nearing pre-crisis production levels, while France and Italy still lag far behind. The BRICS countries are in the lead, China having doubled its 2007 figures, and India expanded its production by over 30%. For Russia, the current industrial production index exceeded that of 2007 by 6%. Manufacturing of consumer goods has been expanding in the last months, especially clothes and shoes, as well as plastic, paper, and rubber goods. However, this growth is offset by a slowing production of such important sectors as electric power and engineering. Investment activity in Russia has also slowed. Still, average supply of capital goods over the last 3 months is 8% higher than in 2008. In particular, car imports figures are much higher than before the crisis. As for the state budget, it was marked by a sound performance in the second quarter of 2013. Russia's budget surplus amounted to 2.3% of GDP. Nevertheless, analysts expect a shortfall in revenues toward the end of the year. This corresponds with the government's preparations to reduce spending. President Putin called for a growth-oriented budget, but at the same time has asked for cuts in spending to match the budget incomes. According to Putin, a high debt load is an issue of national security.
If nothing is done, by 2014, our country will face certain deficit. Next year, it will be more serious, then even more than that. And in the end, we will find ourselves in a very difficult situation. If we are responsible, if we want to feel confident, probably a bit more modest during a certain period of our life, but nevertheless be sure that nothing collapses, blasts or falls apart, then we should act carefully and professionally.
A stability course was the highlight of the Russian president's budget message in June. A revised budget for the next 3 years is expected on October 1st. Lisa Lukin, On the Money, RT.
Okay, Chris, let's continue with the Russian economy on the back of this report here. Can you have a stability budget and still have high productivity? Because this seems to be kind of a binary here. Mr. Kudrin has offered alternatives to the current strategy of the government. Does it make sense to you?
You can for a while. Clearly you can, for a period of months over the winter, emphasizing stability shouldn't do that much damage, as it were, in terms of growth. But, the danger is, of course, you get hooked on stability. Everybody refers back to the Brezhnev era, etc., where stability, gradually became stagnation, and then we had a lost decade or more. So that fear is still in everybody's mind, that if the government just gets stuck in this mindset of stability and doesn't take the risks in terms of the right spending or efficiency or investment policies, etc., then we'll end up in this low growth environment for far too long, when we clearly need initiatives that will drag up investment and the rate of growth.
And sometimes those decisions are painful, as in any economy, and that becomes a political issue here. Mr. Kudrin does have a point in many ways in looking at making stability the be-all and end-all of everything, and it doesn't necessarily create growth.
And he was right in 2008. Mr. Kudrin was right then, because if Russia spent all of its oil windfall at the time to develop some big projects and lost a lot of the money at the time, the economy would be very overheated, and going into the crisis, there would be a tremendous correction, even greater than the one that we had in 2008, 2009. And
which was really quite minor compared to what happened in Western developed countries.
And which was certainly far more smooth, I would say, in terms of the social implications for the wider strata of the population compared to what we had in 1998, because there were these reserves that were used for the benefit of the broader public. So I think that kind of strategy was validated then, and it will continue, at least to some degree, to loom large and to be very significant in terms of the strategic view of the Russian authorities. But one other point I wanted to make is that we shouldn't solely focus on the budget situation when looking at the potential efficiency improvements. One major area which is frequently overlooked is, of course, the corporate sector, including Russia's state companies. And I think in terms of forging ahead with better corporate governance, in terms of controlling costs far better than they used to do before, I think this is clearly one of the top priorities for the next several years.
Yaroslav brings up a good point, because we keep talking about what the state is doing, but the corporate sector bears an enormous amount of responsibility as well.
Sure. Yeah, of course, a big chunk of, I guess, of the industrial base is state controlled, or is linked to the state in one form or another. So we have tended in the past to lump the two together, and the kind of non-state part of the industrial base is certainly growing. It hasn't been significant in the past, but is becoming more significant. The likes of companies like Magnit, etc., all have very, comparable valuations to similar companies in the rest of the world, because they're regarded as new generation Russian companies, good corporate governance, behaving well, performing well. So as that group, but we're back to the same question again. Okay, we have the short-term issue of what's going to happen to the economy over the next 6 to 9 months and what the issues are. But the bigger picture, of course, is just the development of the economy, of the corporate base. In other words, the state taking a step back and letting the corporate world and entrepreneurs get on with this. I mean, that's clearly, we need to see that again.
It's a big threshold to overcome.
To some degree, we're talking about two paradigms of development. This is the juncture which Russia is facing right now, whether this is top-down modernization with big projects being pursued and this being essentially state-led largely, or is this a bottoms-up process of liberalizing the business regime for all of the companies and making it a level playing field in order for the economy to generate greater growth going forward in a more sustainable way? These are the two different views that I think currently are battling with each other.
Are they good bedfellows?
They can be. Again, we're down to efficiency and productivity. If the state is more efficient in spending and developing these big projects, which clearly need to happen, then yeah, that can be a major driver and create a very attractive backdrop, if it were, for the for the more entrepreneurial expansion of the economy. I mean, I think it is clear again. I hate using words like it's different this time. The four most expensive words in the English language, we all know. But it is important, though, to look at the various stages stages in Russia. We had the 90s, then we had the 2000, 2008, and we've had the crisis. We're now at the threshold of a new phase. Now, it could go badly wrong. It could end up being just flatlining, or it could be the start of something interesting. But what is interesting right now is there's a much more open debate and much greater acknowledgement of what needs to be done.
And it's much more politicized. I think we all have to admit that. All right, I want to change gears a little bit. Let's talk about dithering and tapering the Fed and quantitative easing. Chris, explain it to me. What's going on?
Well, I can't. It's extraordinary the way the Fed has behaved over the summer, making the announcement as they did in May, and then not following through. And, again, you used the word dithering. I think it's as good a word as any to say to describe what
I took it from your report.
Okay, fair enough. As to what they've been doing for the last several months. And of course, as we can all know, it's created a great deal of uncertainty, particularly in the emerging market world, and a lot of volatility in emerging market equities and currencies.
So what is it? They're afraid of letting go of cheap credit. I mean, that's what it looks like to me, and that's an intensely political issue. And they're the emerging market countries that are, getting sick and tired of importing somebody else's inflation here.
That's the whole thing about current growth that we're seeing in the world economy, in the developed world, that a lot of it is being bred by cheap money, and that there's a certain dependence now on the part of the whole system on that addiction to that kind of cheap money continuing to come from the Fed, from the European Central Bank, etc. And that means that apart from the sheer quantity of growth, there's also the question of quality of growth. And the quality is not really there because most of the growth momentum still is too dependent on this cheap money coming still from the regulators.
Angela Merkel's back. Okay, is she going to get tough on the Eurozone?
I would expect so. I mean, what we've heard from her so far is that policies will remain as before, no major change. My assumption is that those are just holding statements until she gets the coalition and gets it in place. But we already know that the ECB is preparing to get much tougher on the Eurozone banks to bring all of the region's banks into line with, for example, the definition of bad debts. For an example, in Germany, 90 days plus, that's a bad debt. In Italy, 120 days plus. So bringing the banks into line could reveal some more nasties and require more bailouts. So I think it's a reasonable expectation to say that we're going to have more volatility and some concerns in the Eurozone over the winter. And that combination of, again, say, dithering on the part of the Fed, the uncertainty that is created, and what we're likely to see, maybe a move to clean house and take more decisive action in Europe. In that sense, it's difficult to argue why Putin is wrong for not emphasizing stability.
Exactly, and I think the Eurozone they still very need much a stiff, hard hand, a fist.
Absolutely.
And I think Merkel's
the whole problem with Europe throughout the past several years, I think, was precisely the lack of sticking to rules. So essentially, the European Union was predicated on a set of criteria, on a set of rules that countries had to abide by. And a lot of the crisis that we saw recently in the past several years was precisely due to the fact that while Europe was talking about the need for a lot of the other countries to follow these fiscal rules and all of the other rules, a lot of its countries were not following through on most of these.
Okay, let's talk about rules here. We're almost out of time, gentlemen. The budget battle on Capitol Hill, another big headache?
Probably not. And markets are not pricing in anything. They assumed that there'll be a lot of brinkmanship. We'll go to midnight and then a little bit of slippage here and there. But basically, investors assume that deals will be done. Nobody will want the consequences of not doing a deal.
Our view is that at the very last moment there will be a deal, but at the very last moment, only after a lot of.
Well, that's not
stuff.
leading. The largest economy in the world is not leading very well when it gets down to that. We're out of time, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests here, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here on the Money. See you next time, and stay with RT.